Welcome back to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology. I am Brami Gieben, an author, critic, and musician with a passion for philosophy, art, and culture. Today, I'm going to speak to a novelist and cult literary icon, ARX-Han. Han is the author of Incel, a novel, a searing, existentially bleak portrait of a young man alienated from society and at war with himself. This novel made a huge impression on me, bringing to mind the vivid prose and themes of early Bret Easton Ellis, Chuck Palahniuk, and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. I believe that this is a really important and powerful debut from an incredible author, which is why I chose to write about it a little bit in my new book, Crisis Masculinity. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome ARX-Han to the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's always really wonderful to connect with anyone who had a meaningful experience, engaging with my novel or my blog writing. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, you're more than welcome. It's a fantastic novel. I've got lots of thoughts about it, which I'm sure we'll kind of get into, unpack during our conversation. I wonder, for those who haven't read the novel, could you give us a brief summary of what you think it's about and how you came to write it?
Absolutely. So there's what I would describe as kind of the surface level summary, and then there's what I would describe as sort of the philosophical or existential level summary. So the book is kind of nominally about this sort of young social isolate, of course, deeply alienated from society, who is effectively on this quest to have his kind of, first experience of intimacy, with a woman. And it reads like a sort of modern contemporary literary satire that's also inflected, of course, with a great deal of sadness and despair, and it sort of oscillates between those two modes very rapidly. That being said, the kind of narrative structure, in many ways, is a exploratory vehicle for these kind of deeper philosophical themes, essentially around what I would describe as scientistic nihilism, right? So the kind of absolute metricization of human intersexual relations and romance, and extreme sort of reductionism. And I think, not to, pat myself on the back, because I was only one of many, writers who've identified the kind of macro level trend here. But I think that since the release of the book, we've only seen a kind of further metricization of human intersexual relations. Obviously, looks maxing is downstream from many of the concepts and ideas that were kind of presented in the book, which were, of course, just a mirror of online discourse at that time. And we see now this even more intense cultural evolutionary pressure to formulate the human being's desirability in terms of things like biological metrics, like facial parameters and things of that nature. And Clavicular obviously has gone kind of parabolic in terms of his the attention that he's kind of getting in this social commons, not merely because of the medium that he's using to distribute these ideas in the form of live streaming, but rather the ideas themselves as being reflective of a kind of more intense sociosexual competition dynamic that is now kind of made the marketplace of romantic and intimate relations sort of hyper-liquid, if you will.
Nice. Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that term hyperliquidity a little bit later. But I think that term you use, metricization, is a really important one, because we're talking about the ways in which human desire and indeed human agency is now so controlled or dictated or motivated by the algorithm. Everything can be categorized and expressed as data. Is that kind of the point you were driving at with that term?
Yes, but I think the reason the data is important, the framework of data is so relevant is because it implies a certain determinism and a certain reducibility. Okay, so it's deterministic in the sense that so long as a human being has ABC physical parameters and so forth, it's sort of biologically determined that they will rank higher in terms of desirability. And it's reducible in the sense that it validates a model of extreme reductionism in the sense that this thing that perhaps historically in earlier times was framed as impossible to distill or evanescent or transcendent. When we think in terms of the earlier notions of romance, even those notions spanning back only perhaps 15, 20 years, these things were invariably never presented in these extremely kind of harsh reductionistic terms, right? Because of course that would sort of pop the worldview of the romantic, right? And so now it's like we're in this kind of like post-romantic era where the human being is sort of this like biological computer that responds to stimulus and response. And I think the thing that most people don't appreciate about the phenomenon of something like looks maxing as a worldview or a mental schema is that this sort of thing actually is just downstream of a lot of kind of just like empirical scientific studies. Now, of course, we can always debate the validity of those things. And that's not to say that things like evolutionary psychology have been relentlessly and repeatedly misinterpreted or instrumentalized in the service of much more ideological projects, right? Obviously, you see that with things like the manosphere. But what I find interesting is just the rate of cultural evolution around these things. So I'm like a middle-aged millennial, and I'm now at the stage where I've seen, I think probably like 3 iterations of normative discourse around what is considered acceptable behavior in this domain, and what the kind of operating mental models are for both genders. With respect to hyperliquidity, I'm interested in what your question is there.
Yeah, let me skip ahead to that one. I think that's a good place to bring that in. So yeah, you've kind of referred to hyperliquidity as this term to describe what's happening within that app-driven dating market. How do you think that hyperliquidity and that quantifiability of the data involved, how does that affect the way we think about love and relationships?
Well, I think it's extremely corrosive, essentially, right? And so essentially, so in markets you have this notion of liquidity, right? Which is basically, and I'm a retard when it comes to finance, so I'm gonna butcher the definition of this. But basically, it's like if I wanted to buy or sell something at a certain price, how much friction, how difficult is it for me to do that in large quantities and large volumes, right? So if we analogize to interpersonal relations, it's like if so and so male individual wishes to meet X number of potential partners. What is the level of effort and what is the level of friction required to do that, and vice versa for the opposing gender as well. So obviously, in the pre-software app-driven algorithmic matching era, a person had to essentially physically go out into the world to, meet other individuals, right? And so actually, that's actually a very high friction thing because one is sort of gated by how much time one has to initiate ABC number of interactions and so forth, right? So the transition towards the app-driven era dramatically increased the liquidity of this quote unquote market, right? This marketplace of transacting bodies, as it were, right? And in doing so, when you dramatically increase the efficiency of a system, you effectively subtract uncertainty, unpredictability, and randomness from it, because it operates so smoothly and at such scale that things like serendipity are almost totally obviated and so forth, right? And so obviously I'm far from the only person to make this observation. I think many people online will explain how sort of demoralizing the process of using these kinds of apps is. I mean, I don't really personally have I don't really have any substantial personal experience using them, but at least from what my friends sort of tell me, it is just kind of this like there's almost like a feeling of pervasive doom, which I think is kind of interesting. But again, I think for me, what's interesting is just the macro level trend, right? So so obviously everybody has made this observation, and I think if you widen your aperture, the question becomes, well, what is the analysis that we can bring to account for the observation, right? There's a surface level analysis, which is centered around the development of technology and just all markets becoming more efficient over time of every kind, facilitated by technology. But for me, I think the thing that's interesting is it's part of this kind of broader macro trend towards disenchantment with the world and further reductionism being applied to all human relations. Because I have a hypothesis, I have a theory that a great deal of meaning in life is actually born of ignorance. It's born of ignorance around the mechanisms of internal cognition, how human choices are made, whether the choices are freely willed or not, and so forth, both for yourself and for others. When that mystery is dissipated with information, awareness, knowledge, and understanding, even just in a neuroscientific manner, I think there's a sort of inevitable meaning collapse that takes place. This is not necessarily something driven by artificial intelligence, although I think things like artificial intelligence drive collapse of meaning through other vectors. And so that's kind of my high-level view there. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you out of order.
No, not at all. No, that makes a ton of sense, and I think you're right to say that, like the removal of that friction, that sort of creates a situation where there's no magic, there's no improvisation, there's no room for happy accidents. So I think anybody who's used dating apps would recognize that as a truth. And I'm kind of a similar age than you. I'm a sort of elder millennial. I'm mid-40s. So again, I don't have much experience of the dating apps myself, but it's fascinating to me how much of the choices that I made in life and where I ended up and the partners that I've been with were driven by random chance. It's hard for me to imagine a world where that is ordered like a shopping experience, which is kind of how you've described it in a couple of blog posts. So that makes a ton of sense. To get back to the topic of the incel, I mean, obviously a lot of ink has been spilled over the kind of crisis of masculinity. The idea of incels as some sort of insurgent group that pose a massive threat to mainstream society. You in a previous essay have called the incel the quintessential literary subject for our time. What do you feel makes the figure of the incel so important as a subject to write about?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question because it helps me justify writing the book, which was quite a bit of effort. And again, I'm so glad that commentators and writers such as yourself have connected with it. So for me, the reason that the character of that type of young man is so central is because he sits at the nexus of multiple overlapping kind of giga trends, right? And anytime within a social structure that you are positioned at this kind of intersecting node, you inevitably just become a kind of signifier of your age, of your era. And that, of course, is kind of meta-narrative, right? That is, that's just very important. So, what are those trends? One trend is this trend towards increased general social alienation, born of modernity and born of technological development, more and more advanced forms of automation and industrialization. The other kind of trend is essentially this trend of uh, increasing scientific reductionism, where the human being is increasingly parameterized, measured, and predictable using a combination of neuroscience and, let's say, algorithmic computer prediction that just treats the human being almost as like a black box that just produces behavioral outputs under certain conditions, right? And a third trend basically is kind of this macro level sort of death of God and increasing levels of secularization and disenchantment with the world / materialism, right? A fourth trend is the increasingly antagonistic and contested relations between the genders, right? And so I could kind of just go on and on, but of course there's the additional things are diminishing sort of marginal importance, but essentially it's the reason that character is so interesting and so compelling, and why everybody just constantly has to write about these figures, is because I think we kind of just know that in this era, a huge swath of the population is just being left behind. I think the economic analog to the sort of young alienated man in that position is the permanent underclass, right? And I think many people are already freaking out about this. And of course, I have a very bearish view on human labor. I believe very strongly in the ultimate victory of machine intelligence. Now, I have wide bars of uncertainty around timelines. I'm not an AI engineer, so I'm not going to pretend to have expertise here. I can imagine any sort of scenario where we have mass automation in 5 years or in 25 years, resulting in mass unemployment. But there's a kind of social. It's interesting because the incel exists as a permanent underclass member within the sexual marketplace. And of course, they can even be very economically successful. That's why they also there is an economic analog, which is a cross-gender type of description, which is, of course, the member of the permanent underclass, which can be, a man or a woman or, etc.
So one of the terms that you've used in your blog posts when writing about this was androgenic literature. I think that's a really interesting term to use, and I'm interested in why you think the publishing industry should take notice of it. I mean, analysis of literary trends sort of suggests that both male and female readers struggle to relate to male protagonists that they view as pathetic or toxic. Why is it important to you that a character like yours is given room on the page, if that makes it a challenge for readers? And why should the publishing industry be thinking about and publishing androgenic fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of meat on that, so let me kind of tackle it sequentially. So, the first thing is how do you define androgenic literature? Well, androgens are male sex hormones that lead to the masculinization of like the male fetus or something in development, etc. And then of course they produce secondary sexual characteristics like muscularity, facial features, and etc. right? So when I say androgenic literature, I literally mean literature that is in some way, shape, or form driven by the biological motor of maleness. And contained within that umbrella space, the essential idea is the presenting an unvarnished view of real male interiority, and in particular at the margins. When I say at the margins, I mean things like aggression, psychopathy, desire, things of that nature, right? And I think that, look, a lot of ink, particularly on Substack, has been spilled about this, but obviously there are multiple interlocking trends that have led effectively to the minimization within traditional publishing of books of this nature. The cultural, moral, and political Overton window has shifted so substantially that we went from an era where extremely kind of crass, lowbrow male literature is being published. I'm thinking of stuff like Tucker Max in the mid 2000s and Chad Kalkin in the mid 2000s. And I don't want to diminish the writing of these guys. They're certainly much more successful than I was or am. And I think they're both good at what they did at that time. Of course, we look back on it and we're almost kind of like shocked at how intense a lot of the material is. If you skim the average American male today, you're kind of just like, wow, this is really extreme, right? Like, holy shit. But I think the reason that it's important is because my view of literary fiction is that it's a slice of human consciousness that's preserved in text form. I think the reason that voice is so central in literary fiction, okay, when people say voice, the voice carries the book, which I think is generally speaking true. It's not that, really technical and beautiful prose is in service to a voice, right? Voice is like the emergent property of the text. It's the feeling you get when you read the text. But actually, I have a parallel view, which is that voice is the feeling of what it is like to inhabit a particular individual's consciousness. And so for me, a novel is a bottling of human consciousness, and you're storing it in the form of a text, right? And that's true both of third and first person fiction, which just presents different layers of depth of the mind, right? So if you sort of arbitrarily say we're just going to block anybody from writing books that present these types of minds, I think it's a unreasonable constriction of the overall aperture of literary production because it's 50% of the population, right? And it doesn't mean that you're publishing. Like I think when people look at this term and they look at androgenic fiction, it's like it must be about extremists or guys going into the woods to start groups with rifles or pre-contemplative mass shooters. I think that's a very kind of silly reduction of the space of possibilities. I think a good novel that just came out is, for example, Dryback by Juan Ecke from New Ritual Press. I mean, I think that was a good representation of kind of the middle-aged, fading male. A book that I truly loved was David Soloy's Flesh, which is I'm shocked the British press, the British traditional publishing sector published it almost, and also that it won a Booker. I think Soloy, I haven't thought about it super deeply, but I think the way he approached the subject matter was quite clever because he comes at it rather obliquely. And so because the protagonist Istvan is, you never really deeply dive into how he thinks about human desire. It never gets super uncomfortable for, say, the progressive white female liberal archetype reader. And so I think that's kind of how he got it through. But it's even within the constraint of this limited presentation of interiority, it's just a really beautifully executed book in my view. I really tremendously enjoyed it. It's probably the first mainstream book about maleness that I've read that I thought was good, and I can't remember how long. Everything else that's good is typically self-pubbed, or in this domain is typically self-pubbed or like at least 20 years old.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned interiority, because that was what I was struck by reading the book, is that it's so rare to see, the interiority of a subject like this depicted in literature now. But 20 years ago, it was common. I grew up reading books like the early Bret Easton Ellis, early Chuck Palahniuk, and those were
Yeah.
the kinds of
Yeah.
authors that people were chucking six-figure deals at back in the early 2000s,
Yeah.
late 90s.
Yeah.
When I read your novel, I read it back to back with The Wayback Machine by Daniel Falatko. And
Yeah.
for both books, I was just blown away that these were self-published. Like, it blew my mind because the quality of the voice was so real and so vivid, but also the subject matter and that depiction of interiority of a male subject was just not something that I'd encountered in modern fiction that well. But this is the interiority of a very alienated subject that we're talking about in your novel. Was this a kind of difficult place to put yourself in? Like, how different is your character's internal life compared to your own, if that's not too personal a question?
Yeah. Well, I think that the truth is a hell of a lot of fun to write. It's like it's one of these funny things where it's like, ultimately, if you're an artist and you're creating this character, it's got to be entertaining, right? It's got to be entertaining. And for me, things I get entertained when I just ramp up the intensity on everything, right? You just take the human in and just ramp it up to 100x leverage, right? That's fun, and because I'm pretty sure Bret Easton Ellis doesn't have any decomposing bodies in his in his fridge. So I'll kind of answer the question that way, and like at the end of the day, what meditating on human psychological darkness is something that a certain type of artist um, can and must do, because those are really interesting questions, right? And to be frank, I I think it's very important to distance yourself from your work. And my perspective is that I think that auto fiction has become a little bit too lazy. It's become a little bit too lazy, right? Because I'll tell you, I like if I really wanted to, I could have gone out and I could have told some story. I could have told some story about oh, I'm this character, or yeah, it's literally me, you know. First of all, I'm not white, so that wouldn't even really make sense. And the whiteness is obviously a huge component of the narrative here. And I think the psychology of the alienated male of European descent is like super, super interesting to me, even though I'm not white. Okay. But let's say like I could have told like I could have done like an inverse race thing, right? Where it's like I pretend to be white, but I'm not white. You know what I mean? Like that would have been a bit like almost like the inverse woke sales strategy. Like that would have been incredibly funny and hilarious. But like at the end of the day, I think that people just overestimate how crazy, interesting, and extreme your life has to be in order to write interesting characters. Like my life is extremely boring. Like my life is incredibly boring. It's like what's fun for me is opening a book at night if I have time, or playing like video games. Like I'm just like a fucking like normcore, least interested. Like if you saw me on the street, you'd be like, yeah, this is just there's nothing interesting about this guy, right? And I think that like self mythologization is like it's totally valid, but I think that like we remember Mishima and Hemingway because these guys were killer marketers. Like people don't get this. It's a guy like Mishima and a guy like Hemingway. Like these guys were cultivating a persona in a pre-social media era, and they did it damn well. And it was great. It was a hell of a lot of fun, and we're still talking about them decades later, and it created a marketing multiplier on their work. We don't think of it that way because we think of them as legends, but obviously they knew that notoriety would drive literary success, and that's perfectly fine. what where I'm just like not so much of a fan is this like autofiction trend where you sort of collapse the distance between the novelist and the protagonist, and everything is just like this fucking diary. It's like Dear Diary, and it's just I find it very tiresome because I'll tell you why. It limits the flexibility of the character you can write because you're constrained. You constrain yourself, right? If I could only write about a character that thinks very much like me or is 80% me or 90% me, that'd be fucking boring. Nobody would want to read that book. That'd be boring as shit, right? And did we just forget that the whole goddamn point of this enterprise is imagination? You know, it's like, and so sorry, I always go on a rant against autofiction, and it's not even entirely fair because a lot of this stuff is like super super good. Sorry, some of this stuff is super super good. Although I can't cite an example that I like, so maybe that's not true. But like for example, like just write a memoir at that point. You know what I mean? Like just write a fucking memoir. Like Blake Butler's Molly, super good book. It's about the suicide of his wife. Like it's a really good novel. Sorry, it's not a novel. It's a narrative memoir. It's super good. Super super great book. He's not like romanticizing promiscuity in this like super repetitive way that everybody does. Because so much of the autofiction, it's the same shit, man. It's the same shit. There's no depth to it. It's like basically it's romance. It's the romanticization of some combination of narcissism, promiscuity, drug use, and mental illness. I'm sorry. It's not that interesting. It's not that fucking interesting because you're not mentally. Actually, it's not extreme enough a lot of the time because again, it's constrained by reality. Or if it is extreme, it's extreme in this gauche way that's tasteless and is clearly for shock value. The problem is it lacks creativity. It doesn't have the requisite creativity to create a work that stands the test of time. You've got to go out of distribution if you really want to cook, right? You got to go out of distribution. So, look, that doesn't mean that, like any other novelist, I don't see something in the real world and then incorporate it into my book. I'll tell you, a lot of the characters in my novels are certainly inspired by mosaics of other interesting people I've met in my life, and that's fine, right? But, I think anytime you write about male interiority, it's an irresistible question to ask. How much is the novelist mirroring the protagonist that they're writing about? And of course, you see, like in instances like guys like Well Beck, they're legendary because we kind of know all these characters are quote unquote like him, right? And that's okay. But see, Well Beck is not writing autofiction. He's creating a universe. He's creating a narrative universe. People don't appreciate his world building and how damn good he is at world. What Well Beck is doing is so far beyond just spamming his personality in slight permutations, like hitting the Hadouken move in Street Fighter over and over again. It's so much more interesting than that. And so, sorry, that's my uncontrollable rant about like modern autofiction.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think that in a way, we've become so fixated on direct lived experience as a concept that that's become the driver of so much of culture, and it does lead to quite flat, boring cultural objects. I want to go back to what you said about race. I mean, your book engages with masculinity and race in a really interesting way and sees those as very bound together. What do you think binds these discourses together as you see them?
Oh man, that's such a great question. So I first of all, I'm going to give you an incomplete answer because it's been quite some time since I thought about this super deeply. But like I almost have like impulse just to like write a much longer article about this. But I would say my short kind of high level framework is that my view, I have this intuition that masculinity is inherently connected to tribalism, and because it's connected to tribalism, it necessarily has some identitarian connection to race. And I think this is true of all masculinity, all cultural permutations of masculinity. There's this notion of what it means to be. What does it mean to be? I'm just going to make it up. What does it mean to be a strong masculine white man? What does it mean to be a strong masculine black man? What does it mean to be a strong masculine Chinese man or Japanese man or Indian man, etc., etc.? Actually, all these things result from the interplay, obviously, of sort of uh, so all human psychology is the result of an interplay between genetics and environment. We can say that axiomatically, obviously. And yes, it's true that masculinity is partly socially constructed, and I also believe it's partly biologically constructed. I think the evidence bears that out very clearly. I think, you know, I never trust anybody that takes a maximalist view that it's completely it's like we just know all psychological traits and behavioral traits are the output of a complex system that is the brain, and that the brain is a mix of a complex interplay between genetic and environmental traits. We just have overwhelming data to indicate that's true. So anytime people are speaking in these like brusque declarative, statements where it's like purely biologically deterministic or it's like purely environmental, you can just like dismiss everything that comes out of their mouth after that, right? But for me, I think the thing that's actually most interesting, or I think that the thing that's like most salient when it comes to like uh, uh, the aspect of the novel, I think, is the way that what we would call evolutionary mate guarding and sexual jealousy has a racial component. I think that is something that is like this like very uncomfortable thing to talk about, and is often just lapses into like very very extreme viewpoints and gets like super charged. But essentially, like to me, there's almost this like black comedy aspect to the discourse around this because basically every ethnic group has like their own version of this. So it's like let's say you're like a white identitarian. Historically speaking, there's a lot of there's a great deal of discomfort around women of European descent. You know, having partners who are, let's say, African or something like that, right? And then in the East Asian community, there's just like endless. I mean, it's an incredibly tiresome topic. I really don't want to get into that part, but obviously there's like endless discourse around consternation around, say, East Asian women, dating men of let's say European descent or even from other communities. And then like I think in other communities maybe it's like not quite as intense as it is among those two communities. I think it's like this like um, uh, I don't know if I don't really have data to back this up, and I don't spend enough time in like I don't know like talking to like my black friends like what the dialogue is like around this. I don't know how different it is, but like I think there definitely is discourse among the black community, at least from what I've seen online, around discourse around high status members of the community inevitably dating or not inevitably, but being more statistically likely to date white partners, right? And so it's like and there's, by the way, there's also the symmetrical female version of mate guarding as well, which is where if the males of a certain ethnic group date out, there's this like there's often a reaction of criticism from the female to the male side as well. So it's like this. The discourse around this is like a super complicated giant mess, right? I don't really write about this stuff beyond just like integrating it as like a parody into my novel. I think what where it can get interesting potentially is like when you see like a narrative violation of a person's uh, concept of a racial hierarchy around interracial dating, right? So I think that like can produce a lot of cognitive dissonance and sort of consternation as well, right? So like I think like a interesting and from my perspective like very funny example is basically prior to K-pop, like the East Asian male in Western media was presented as this kind of like bumbling idiot, asexual, all these other things, right? There's plenty of ink that's been spilled around this topic, and then all of a sudden there's this like archetype that's presented in narrative formats about the K-pop guy. He's tall, he's rich, he has this like flower boy aesthetic. His hair is very nice. He's got like makeup on. He's not like typically super muscular. And then like all of a sudden the market shifts in terms of its demand for that type of archetype. So I think it's very interesting because these things are like desire is this like plastic thing that can be that shifts in large part due to contingent cultural conditions, which I think is very interesting, and can be a sort of narrative violation if you have a kind of very rigid view of a racial hierarchy of desirability, right? And that cognitive dissonance from from like a male of Western European descent was like interesting narrative fodder for me, right? Because like I mean, I'll tell you, like the first like outliers are always interesting, and I like writing about outliers, right? I mean, for guys in my generation, I'm a middle-aged millennial male. I was like a reasonably big Asian guy, right? Like I used to be more muscular, so I was maybe like 180 pounds, just under 6 feet. So I was like considered like the big, he's not a big guy, but he's like a bigger Asian guy, right? Now I see these kids from China, and they're just rolling in. They're like 20-year-old kids, and they're like 6'3", they're 6'4", and I'm like, God damn, where are they growing these guys, right? And so that like for me, I'd say two things here. I think masculinity is almost intrinsically wrapped in with an identitarian component. It is not necessarily a racial identitarian component because modern notions of race are kind of the cultural evolutionary lineal descendant of earlier notions of tribalism, right? Because if you were like a Frankish knight or something and you were fighting some other slightly different European, you might be phenotypically very similar, but you just hate that guy. You hate the Huguenots or you hate the Germans or you hate the Poles or like we're just gonna kill these guys. Like fuck these guys. Right? Being white doesn't factor into it in like 1400 because everybody's white, right? But the tribalism is still there. It's like yes, I'm of this tribe, right? And so the reason I think it's so interesting is I have a theory that modern geopolitical conflict has a lower level identitarian and racial axis that is simultaneously co-occurring with the actual contest for material resources and contest, say, between political systems. Where I find this is most interesting, and which I allude to in the novel itself, is of course the contest between the United States and China. And I'm personally of the view that a substantial portion of this conflict is, frankly, actually is perceived in Western circles, frankly, as a racial contest. Frankly, I don't think my view is I don't think the Chinese side views world politics as this like zero sum contest between races, but I think uh, the 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 Western European commentariat and think tanks and political class and so forth, I think that due to cultural conditions and perhaps some other factors as well, I think they are, and obviously the lineal historical evolution of the Western political system, I think it tends to view things in this kind of like zero sum contest of races and like and that is effectively like an intrinsically imperial world model, right? And so I find that very interesting because a lot of the time, personally, when I read a lot of like geopolitical stuff, I find it interesting to see if I tease out an undercurrent of racial anxiety here or conflict, and very often I can, although um, I don't think that it overdetermines things. I just think it's interesting. So again, it's like I think that's like a good framework for understanding the novel because you can if you look at the micro, you can also explain the macro, right? So as much as the book stands against reductionism, it also, if you believe in things like emergent properties, then uh, you're not fully a reductionist, but um, you understand that the structure at the small level can determine the structure at a larger level. Now, that's not necessarily reductionistic because emergent properties are the antithesis of reduction, but it's the process of taking a multi-layered view of a phenomenon. And what I love about the form of the novel, what's so engaging about the form of the novel, is that you can flip apertures up and down. And a lot of writers in the contemporary times don't do this because they might be so fixated on, quote unquote, here are the drugs I took on the Upper West Side this night, or, I'm a creative writing professor and I'm dating my student and she's so beautiful. And it's like, but actually the world is like this like big interesting place. And you can look back at, the European novelists to say 100 years ago, and they're writing these sweeping stories that's like, they're zooming in and out, and it's like, oh, here's what it was like to be in this time, right? And Welbeck is notable because he does that in the contemporary era, right? He's always trying to situate his characters in these kind of like macro historical forces. Famously, in the Elementary Particles, he has this short passage where he likens the evolution of the sexual marketplace to the increased competition and power law dynamics of neoliberal market capitalism, right? And again, and so that's why I love that guy so much, and I think I try to do that in my own book as well.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating, and a lot of that stuff you were saying about the connection between race and masculinity maps in an interesting way onto the discourse of the populist right wing in Britain right now. I think one thing that's animated a lot of people to move towards like right wing street protests is the idea that we've got to protect our women, protect our kids, and that is literally driven by like quite a deep seated fear of the other taking your kind of like sexual market value away. So I think that works. I think that definitely tracks. I wanted to talk a little bit about morality. You so many books that you read now sort of seem to be driving towards a set moral outcome or need to conform to a set moral framework in order to be considered publishable. I thought what was really interesting about your characters, you carefully avoided rendering any kind of moral judgment on him, and by the end of the book he's very isolated. He's arguably less happy than where we find him at the start, but you at no point sort of put the blame on this for put the blame for this on the experiences he's been describing. Did you have any kind of preset notions when you started writing about where you wanted to leave the main character, or what you wanted your readers to think about him?
Yeah, so the answer is that I worked from an outline, but it took a long time for the ending to find its shape. And the initial ending I had was very dark. It was him just, on his birthday, being by himself. And I ended the book there. And some of my beta readers, not literally betas, but just, I was just joking. So they told me, like, man, that was good. It was good, but it was really dark. And so ultimately, I think that it's both the case that the text does not judge the character, and also the case that it I think and it presents a opening for him to be redeemed at the end, right? And I don't want to spoil that, but essentially the book ends with an epiphany. It ends with what is effectively an epiphany about the psychology of what love is like for women, right? Because so much of this character's failure is the failure of theory of mind, right? And so, in some sense, the book is about the struggles of, frankly, being, let's say, a high-functioning autistic male, right? Now, it's never overtly explicit about that, and I don't want to canonically make the character autistic because I think at the margins, diagnoses of high-functioning autism are extremely soft diagnoses. It can really be argued either way. But the answer is I didn't know where the book was going, but I did have a understanding that, of course, thinking in very black and white, zero-sum, old-school manosphere, red pill type terms is ultimately corrosive to a man's well-being. And the reason for that is it creates behavioral situations that effectively guarantee one's own immiseration, right? Because if you enter human relations with a fundamentally adversarial zero-sum view, you will close yourself off from positive sum interactions and meaning, right? And so the novel does present a kind of satire of ideological extremism as it comes to gender relations, right? And I think what's so worrisome is in the cultural commons, you can really hyperstition terrible outcomes for a group, right? Because the problem with something like looks maxing is that it's not 100% clear if it's entirely a cause or entirely an effect. It's probably a mix of both. Obviously, we know from psychological science that physical attraction is hugely impactful, but there's probably some plasticity in the neuroplasticity around to what extent physical attractiveness is the most important factor contributes to net attractiveness, right? So if you just convince everybody it's the most important thing, almost definitionally it becomes the most important thing because it attains a status that perhaps could have bloomed from non-looks related factors, right?
Mm.
For me, the book engages with morality in a very interesting way where it sorry, that sounded incredibly narcissistic, but the thing that I was interested about, frankly, is in the novel are notions of free will and moral responsibility. And obviously the book explores these things because if most neuroscientists, like they'll call themselves compatibilists, right? So compatibilism is a school of philosophy where determinism and free will are compatible, or even like a mechanistic system like the human brain and its neurons is compatible with free will. I've never found that view persuasive. I just don't find it persuasive at all. I think if you look at the best philosopher on contemporary terms to read on this that I've encountered is a guy named Greg Caruso, Caruso. So I'm personally not really convinced that free will exists. or that, and downstream of that, it becomes very hard to believe in moral responsibility. And I explore that theme in the novel, and it certainly inflects the way that I treat the protagonist, because even, like, I'll give you an example, right? There's this famous story where this guy murders his wife. He goes to the top of a tower at a university in Texas, and he starts killing people with a sniper rifle, and he leaves behind a suicide note that says, "I don't know what's wrong with me. Please autopsy my brain after I die." And they do it, and he has a tumor in his brain. So, it's like, obviously that's an obvious example, but when you really start to unpack the philosophical arguments around it, I think it does become hard to believe in things like what are referred to as libertarian free will or contra-causal free will, where the mind is the first cause of a given chain of actions that are outputted by a human being. And I think whether or not I am or am not correct about this philosophical framework, it fundamentally changes the way that I approach a protagonist, because I approach a protagonist from a place of thinking about the different factors that produce that human being that were outside of their control. And that is not to say that the book does not engage with morality, because basically you can believe all that to be the case, but you still operate according to a moral framework, because it's psychologically impossible not to do that unless you're already a psychopath, in which case you don't even care about notions of moral responsibility to begin with. So that's my sort of very circuitous answer there.
No, that's great. And I mean, I don't want to spoiler the end as well, but that final scene, and the character of the sister who's involved tangentially, I thought that was just a really elegant way of gathering together the threads of the book, and it was really impactful. So yeah, I mean, I definitely want people to read this and experience it for themselves. I've got a couple more questions. I mean, since you published the book, obviously the question of the incel, or the crisis of masculinity, has become such a mainstream thing. Do you have any sort of like thoughts about some of the key, I guess, texts or films or bits of media that have come out about that, specifically things like the Louis Theroux documentary or Adolescence? How did it make you feel watching these things, having written that novel?
So, truthfully, I don't engage with a lot of the UK stuff on this, because my sense is that it's on like a lag from the American internet.
Mm.
It's on this like 5 to 10 year lag from the American internet. And like, but that said, I do have a high level take. So I didn't see Adolescence. I mean, like going back to, I mean, I don't know what your political views are, but I think if you look at like, what happened in Rotterdam, like, it's pretty understandable that people are going to be really livid. Anytime you have sexual violence happening at scale, particularly by an outgroup, that's like the most maximally combustible scenario for inter-ethnic conflict you could possibly have, which is sexual violence at scale from an outgroup. That has been proven on an evidentiary basis, and then I mean, I don't really have like a strong take on that, like, other than, wow, that's really bad. So subtracting the racial component and just treating it in terms of the masculinity influencer component, right? Because it's like, so sorry, just one more note on that. They would never make Adolescence about like a Pakistani grooming gang. Yeah, like, who's gonna, like, the British film and media industry is never gonna make a adolescent style show about a Pakistani grooming gang, because people will start rioting, right? And I mean, it's politically impossible to do so. But let's take the figure of Tate. Like I just, these guys are just clowns, right? But I'll tell you what's happened. Okay, what's happened is you took like relatively sophisticated but empirically incorrect interpretations of evolutionary psychology that were written by amateur bloggers in like the early 2010s or late 2000s, in the form of guys like Chateau Hartiste or Rollo Tomasi, which were effectively the ideological antecedent of the modern black pill. Okay, then modern incels kind of ramp that up into essentially a model of biological determinism. determining sociosexual success. And then after that, you have basically a bunch of clownish retards in short form video generating these ideas to the most simple and mimetically potent form possible. And everybody just becomes more and more retarded every year. And then, of course, Louis Theroux's going to go in and, like, I mean, look, Louis Theroux went into, like, the West Bank or whatever and was, like, getting shot at by, like, the IDF or whatever, right? Like if, for him to talk to, like, some of these, like, clowns on the internet, it's, like, nothing for a documentarian who has any salt, right? So, and I don't, frankly, even know very much about him at all. So my take, basically, is that short-form video is psychologically dramatically more potent than text in mimetic distribution, the distribution of cultural memes, and has radically accelerated the speed of cultural evolution. Okay? However, because the medium is constrained in the amount of information that it can disseminate per unit time, unlike text, it can only spread the simplest and most retarded form of an idea. And so what you get is like a 1,000-word blog post from Hartiste becomes, a 500-word blog post from Rollo Tomasi, which becomes a 5-minute YouTube video about hypergamy, which becomes a 30-second Andrew Tate clip about, quote unquote bitches and hoes, or whatever the fuck retarded thing that he says. And yeah, he's super camera, like he understands how to work a camera, and he understands content production, and now he's incarcerated because he's also apparently a criminal, which is unsurprising to anybody that has read anything about what this guy's been up to. And so it's like I think this stuff is important because it's a signifier of it's a data point on the mechanism of cultural degeneration. And like whatever I thought the ceiling on gender discourse toxicity was, actually it's like 50 times higher than I initially thought it was. Or I'm exaggerating. It's like 5 to 10x worse than I thought it originally was.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fascinating, and I think like what you're saying about the way that complex concepts are boiled down by the attention economy until the point where they become so bowdlerized and compressed that all they can be is like dogma, like vote yes or no on this thing. I mean, you could say that same arc has been followed by content creators who speak about identity politics from the kind of gender identitarian side of it. By the time you've boiled down Judith Butler to a 15-second video, it's kind of useless. So that's a really great answer, I think. No, thank you. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I think we've really dived into some important aspects of why this book is significant, and hopefully what readers can get out of it. I'm interested to hear what's next for you. This novel's been out in the world for a little while now. Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. I released it 3 years ago. I've sold about 1,000 copies, and I haven't really been marketing it for a while, so sales have tapered off. I might do like a audiobook installment and just put it out for free. And I've been in discussions with some folks about possibly republishing it, which would be great. We'll see whether that pans out or not. But I'm working on a much shorter novella. I hope to finish it by the end of the year. It's tentatively a modern retelling of Ecclesiastes in the age of the permanent underclass. I'm increasingly excited about working on it, but I've just been, some combination of poor plus wage cutting for the past, 2 or so years. So I just haven't really had any time or energy for writing. But fortunately, that's looking to change. So I think optimistically, maybe in a year I might have something out, depending on how perfectionistic I end up being about editing this thing. I want to write a lot faster because the last one took way too long, and I was a little bit obsessed with using a very maximalist prose style, which just takes much longer to cook and edit because you're trying to make every sentence so perfect and interesting. And I think this next one is going to be more in the style of like a more simply written, say, Japanese novel from the late 20th century or something to that effect, like Osamu Dazai or a Mishima. These guys are not writing the most insane sentences possible. They're kind of just trying to give you a feeling using simpler language. So hopefully I can do that.
Brilliant. I'm really excited to read that. I love Mishima, and people like even like Murakami. Those texts from that era are again something that we don't see as enough of now. And as much as I would love to see you sort of flourish in the more traditional publishing industry, I think it's really important what you're doing in terms of building a profile outside of it, to focus on things like androgenic literature and maximalist text and all of these things we've discussed. I think it's really, really valuable, worthwhile work that you're doing there. So listen, thank you very, very much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Fantastic. So you've been listening to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology, hosted and produced by myself, Bram E. Gieben. If this is the first episode you've checked out, thanks for listening and subscribing. You can join in the conversation at strangeexiles.substack.com, where you'll also find a host of links, reading recommendations, and the names of some of the thinkers and writers that ARX-Han and I discussed in this episode. Just time for a short plug as well. My book, Crisis Masculinity, is out on 10th of September, featuring a little bit of discussion about ARX-Han's novel in the final chapter. So I hope you'll go check that out, follow the links in the show notes. Until next time, take care of each other.